going about their daily lives just because of who they are. I'm particularly concerned that these attacks, along with the growing climate of hateful rhetoric, intimidation, and targeted violence that we are seeing across the country, are a signal of something worse to come. If the federal government does not take swift action to address this festering threat, I fear we'll see more tragic attacks and lose more lives to domestic violent extremism. But effectively combating this growing threat requires the federal government to accurately assess it, track and publicly report these incidents, and use that data to ensure that we are devoting the appropriate resources and personnel to tackle the threat. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have tracked data related to domestic violent extremism and concluded that our nation is facing the highest levels of violence based on religion, race, ethnicity, and politics in decades. I'm disappointed that despite these clear warning signs, the federal government has failed to effectively track rising domestic terrorism threat. I've been raising concerns about this failure for years. I worked alongside Senator Johnson to write a provision signed into law as part of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act to require DHS, FBI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to better track and publicly report this critical data. Despite passing the law, the first report was nearly 9 months overdue and did not provide all of the requested data. We need to get serious about taking on these heinous threats and the violence that stems from them. In my view, we must change the way the federal government approaches domestic terrorism. That will require not only improving the way government tracks the threat, but also better understanding how these hateful ideologies spread across social media platforms and how that online transmission can lead to real-world violence. This is an issue that this committee will continue to examine throughout the year. And I look forward to taking what we learned from our witnesses today and using it to inform our efforts going forward. Whether we are conducting oversight or working on additional policy solutions, we must ensure that we're doing everything in our power to address the grave threat posed by domestic terrorism. With that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing to examine the persistent and concerning threat posed by domestic terrorists and violent extremists. This is a threat to communities all across our country. Today we will hear from representatives of certain communities that have been affected by the violence they have experienced. While I'm very much looking forward to hearing their testimony, it's important we recognize all communities that have been impacted by domestic terrorism and violent extremism. Not all of those are represented here today. It's important to recognize the threat of all types of domestic terrorism. Interestingly, just in the last week here in the United States Senate, we have been learning more about one of those domestic terrorist threats listed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that we won't hear about today. This is eco-terrorism. It turns out that one of the nominees from the Biden administration, nominated to run the Bureau of Land Management, had been involved in eco-terrorism, putting spikes into trees that then cause injury to loggers and others who were involved in timbering. So there are lots of kinds of terrorism. Domestic terrorists and violent extremists are not a new phenomenon, nor are the methods that are used to advance their causes. As chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is a subcommittee of this full committee, I held a hearing in July of 2016 examining foreign terrorists' use of our Internet and social media platforms for radicalization and recruitment. That hearing was also aimed at understanding the threat and how the federal government was and should be addressing that threat, and we heard directly from witnesses at the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the State Department. This was a bipartisan investigation, and it was shocking. I'm disappointed that we will not hear testimony today from a single government official about how the federal government is addressing the domestic terrorism and violent extremism threat. Each of the witnesses at that July 2016 Permanent Subcommittee Investigations hearing highlighted the challenges we face in combating terrorism and violent extremism in the age of the Internet, including the reality that the digital environment often accelerates recruitment and radicalization efforts, and the speed with which individuals online can mobilize to violence, often referred to as the flash-to-bang effect. 5 years later, we are still seeing the same weapons being used within our own communities, and we are also increasingly seeing many domestic violent actors connecting with and learning from foreign groups and individuals. Domestic terrorists and violent extremists, inspired by a range of ideological beliefs, on the right and on the left, are increasingly using these digital platforms to spread hate and incite violence here at home. As Americans, we value our First Amendment rights, of course, including the right to express our beliefs. But nothing gives someone a right to carry out acts of violence. We must also acknowledge recent violence in the form of assaults on government, specifically law enforcement. Violent extremists from all segments of the ideological spectrum are increasingly targeting the military, law enforcement, and government personnel. I wrote a letter to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, in May, requesting information on what the department was doing to deter and combat these violent attacks, including on their personnel. Any attack on our nation's law enforcement or other government officials is an attack on the rule of law and on our American ideals. The safety and security of our communities has been a key priority for this committee and for me. After the Pittsburgh Tree of Life tragedy in October of 2018, I brought together leaders of faith-based groups and nonprofit entities across Ohio for a faith security conference in Columbus to discuss how to best respond to these threats. We had the Department of Homeland Security there. We had the FBI there. We talked about what could be done, and at that conference, we said that Congress can and should do more. And I redoubled our efforts here in Congress to provide communities with the resources needed to protect themselves from acts of violence. I've worked to establish and support the Department of Homeland Security's Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which allows nonprofits to apply for funds they can use to secure their facilities. Last year, our bipartisan Protecting Faith-Based and Nonprofit Organizations from Terrorism Act, with Chairman Peters, was signed into law, which authorized a record $75 million annually for 5 years for this grant program. Further, in wake of the recent violence against religious communities, I sponsored the bipartisan Pray Safe Act with Senators Hassan, who's with us today, Senator Johnson, Rounds, Peters, and Rosen, to establish a federal clearinghouse so that faith-based entities can access safety and security best practices, available federal grant programs, and training opportunities. The threats and senseless attacks on all faith-based organizations and houses of worship must stop. But in the interim, I urge my colleagues to support this important bipartisan legislation to provide that critical information. I'm pleased to see my former Ohio colleague in the U.S. House of Representatives among our witnesses today, Eric Fingerhut, and I appreciate his personal commitment to and the Jewish Federation of North America's support of the Pray Safe Act and the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Let me be clear. There is no place for hatred or bigotry of any kind toward our fellow citizens. In confronting these challenges, we must take a holistic approach to these threats. Today's witnesses will speak to this topic. We also need to hear and learn from government witnesses who are not here today about the magnitude of the threat and how the federal government is responding to it. Only after hearing these relevant perspectives can we develop a comprehensive strategy to combat these troubling trends. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. Again, I look forward to your insights and perspectives, but most importantly, your ideas on how we can better combat terrorism and violent extremism in our country so that we can learn what more Congress can and should do to counter those threats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. And as you're well aware, this is a complex and an important issue. And I agree with you that we need to hear from government witnesses. It's our intent to bring them in when we come back in September to have a hearing with them to pick up on what we're going to cover today as well as on Thursday. It's the practice of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you will stand and raise your hand, including those on video, I'd appreciate it. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
The record, everybody answered affirmatively. You may be seated. Thank you. Our first witness today is Mr. Wade Henderson, who currently serves as the interim president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which advocates on behalf of more than 200 national civil and human rights member organizations. The Leadership Conference's members include the Anti-Defamation League, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, and the American Jewish Community, among others. Prior to his role with the Leadership Conference, Mr. Henderson was the Washington Bureau Director of the NAACP. Welcome, Mr. Henderson. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing today on the federal response to domestic terrorism. Last week, the House Select Committee held its first hearing investigating the violent January 6th attack on this very institution, an attack fueled by white supremacy. We all saw a Confederate flag unfurled in the Senate chamber that day. We all saw people wearing anti-Semitic paraphernalia. And we all saw a noose constructed outside of the U.S. Capitol. It was unlike anything we have experienced since the Civil War. As we heard from Capitol and Metropolitan police officers who were on the front lines that day, the horrific consequences of the insurrection are still with us now. And for our diverse coalition, made up of more than 220 national organizations committed to the protection of civil and human rights, this violence is anything but new. For more than 400 years, Black, Brown, and Native people and other marginalized groups have borne the brunt of structural inequality, racism, and discrimination. Policies like American chattel slavery, the forced removal of Native people from their homelands, Black codes, Jim Crow segregation, redlining, lynchings, and racial discrimination have all contributed to intergenerational harm that persists today. Indeed, today marks the 2-year anniversary of the tragic attack in El Paso, Texas, when a white supremacist gunman murdered 23 people. We know that for too long, the threat of this violence has been weaponized, not only by white supremacists, but also by laws and programs that target us rather than protect us. To address white supremacist violence and terrorism, I'd like to offer 4 recommendations today. First, Congress must pass the For the People Act to push back against the great white supremacist lie that encouraged the January 6th insurrection and has given rise to unprecedented attacks against voting rights. This Friday marks the anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Senate must pass S1 and honor the many who gave their lives to protect our democracy. Second, Congress should demand that federal agencies show how they are fighting white supremacist violence through existing tools and reject any new domestic terrorism charge or sentencing enhancements. There are already more than 50 terrorism-related statutes on the books and over a dozen other criminal laws, some of which are being used to prosecute the January 6th insurrectionists. Our nation's long history of abusing national security mechanisms, including the use of COINTELPRO against Dr. King, the post-9/11 targeting of Arabs and Muslims, and the FBI's prioritization of, quote, Black identity extremists, unquote, serve as cautionary tales of how expanded national security authority leads to unjust targeting of already over-policed communities. Third, Congress must identify ways to address and dismantle white supremacy in law enforcement. While many police officers work to fulfill their duties honorably, transformational change is still needed to address the culture of policing that helps promote white supremacy groups, as well as discriminatory policing practices and policies that make us all less safe. Congress must demand a full accounting of how law enforcement is addressing white supremacy in their ranks. And the White Supremacy in Law Enforcement Information Act is a good first step. Congress and federal agencies must also identify ways to ensure that officers who incite racist violence are no longer welcome. It's why the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is so important. Finally, Congress must pass H.R. 40 to study reparations for African Americans and create a U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Excuse me. May and June 2021 marked the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, when a white supremacist mob murdered Black Americans and burned the businesses and homes to destroy the successes of the Black Tulsa community. Yet many Americans still know nothing about this tragedy or others that have flowed from slavery until today. Black people have been targeted with brutal violence, and they continue to be deprived of the benefits of economic growth. Congress must pass H.R. 40 and come to terms with the contradiction of who we say we are as a democracy and who we actually are. Reparations are owed, transformation is required. Now is the time to create a shared vision for our nation, one where all people feel safe, valued, and heard. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, so I just want to point something out for everybody, because he said now is the time to do the shared values where everyone feels heard, valued, and what else? Safe. Okay, yeah, this violent rhetoric that they're spouting about white supremacy and that saying the January 6th event was white supremacist, there's no evidence of that. Confederate flag, to some people, including black people, does not mean racism or KKK or anything like that. Yeah, there was a guillotine. Someone made a really good point and said, why don't we have video of a truck that dropped off the guillotine? Why don't we have any license plate numbers? Why don't we have anybody that was seen even carrying that thing before it got to the Capitol? Why was it only up for about 30 minutes before it was taken down and completely disappeared? And we have no evidence of it whatsoever outside of the videos that were put out there. I mean, this is rhetoric, guys. So the only thing I ask is that be nice in the chat, okay? Because we can't get kicked off of social media as much as social media tries to kick us off.
Members of this distinguished committee, this is indeed an important hearing which covers a truly pernicious threat to racial, ethnic, and religious communities, and that requires a compelling and timely congressional response. I speak, of course, of the rise of domestic and violent extremism. Senator Peters, Mr. Chairman, you outlined correctly the role of the Jewish Federations. I know that the distinguished members of this committee are familiar with the work of the Jewish Federation system and with our volunteer and professional leadership in your respective states. And we thank you for all the many ways that you have each supported our mission across the full spectrum of Jewish communal life. Now, security has always been a core concern of Jewish federations. We know that the ability and the confidence of our community to participate fully in Jewish religious and cultural life depends on feeling safe. Safe to attend synagogue, safe to drop our children off at the Jewish Community Center for preschool or day camp, safe to walk down the street wearing visibly Jewish head coverings and clothing, safe to gather in groups to celebrate, to mourn, to support our brothers and sisters in the state of Israel, and to be active in the life of our communities, our campuses, and our civic associations. Now, our current era of security investments began immediately post 9/11, recognizing that the violent extremism that reached American shores that infamous day would certainly have consequences for our Jewish communities. Many Jewish federations began organizing local community security initiatives, led by experienced and trained local community security directors, to work with each of the synagogues and Jewish institutions in their communities. Today, roughly 45 Jewish federations have such initiatives and are currently raising and allocating approximately $30 million in private funds to this effort, above and beyond what each school, each synagogue, Jewish community center, and social service agency must spend on its own security. And we are in the middle of an extensive national effort called Live Secure, to ensure that every Jewish federation has such a system in place for its community. Now, at the national level, the Jewish Federations of North America helped create the Secure Community Network to offer the support our communities needed to establish and maintain these initiatives. as well as to provide communications links to and liaison with national law enforcement. We've been proud to work with the Department of Homeland Security since its creation to advance this work. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the Jewish community, the rising threat not only includes, of course, the horrific killing of 11 Jewish congregants who were praying at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in October 2018, but also includes the mass shootings at a synagogue in Poway, California in December 2018, and at a kosher market in Jersey City, New Jersey in December 2019, the deadly machete attack at a Hanukkah celebration in Muncie, New York, also in December 2019, the numerous physical attacks on the streets of Brooklyn and other communities that appear related to the clothing and appearance of Jewish victims, and now the most recent multiple stabbing of a rabbi in Boston this summer in front of the synagogue where he works. And of course, these are further exacerbated by the appearance of too many instances of anti-Semitic arson, vandalism, and disrupted plots and online hate that contain implicit threats of violence to come. To say that the Jewish community regards physical safety as today's highest priority and as a matter of great urgency is not an overstatement. Now, in 2004, Congress established the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. This is a coordinated, centralized program that promotes meaningful engagement of at-risk nonprofits with federal, state, or local homeland security officials, and provides critical resources to carry out preparedness planning and training, as well as the acquisition of target hardening investments. The program is groundbreaking, but it's tiny by federal standards. In its 17 years, it has assisted between 140 and 1,500 nonprofits annually at an average yearly appropriation of $35 million. This year, Congress appropriated $180 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which supported more than 1,500 awards, but this is still a tiny percentage of the approximately 350,000 to 400,000 individual congregations within the United States and 1.3 million charitable nonprofits serving communities throughout the country. We respectfully request that the Congress ensure that the resources are there to fulfill all the legitimate and documented applications that are made. Nevertheless, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, while important, cannot in and of itself adequately mitigate the risk to the charitable sector of this great threat. We therefore respectfully request that Congress designate the charitable sector as a critical part of the nation's infrastructure, supported by a comprehensive plan and the necessary resources to manage its risks, resilience, and security outcomes, as this has afforded 16 other currently designated vital sectors. Substantially increase the funding to the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, as I have suggested, and to further ensure the integrity of the program, to include the quality of its and to improve the quality of its oversight and technical assistance to its stakeholders. We ask that Congress provide additional and specified resources to the NSGP program office located within FEMA, and that Congress allow the state administrative agencies to withhold up to 5% of the NSGP awards to cover their management and administrative costs. We request that Congress increase access to DHS's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies, protective security advisors, and cybersecurity advisors, and as Chairman Peters mentioned, enact the Pray Safe Act and Ranking Member Portner to improve stakeholder outreach and engagement by establishing a federal clearinghouse through which faith-based organizations, houses of worship, and other nonprofits can access centralized information on safety and security best practices. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, members of the committee, thank you for holding today's hearing to explore what compelling steps the committee and Congress should take to ensure the safety and security of nonprofit organizations, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Engerhut. Our third witness is Mr. John Yang, as president of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Mr. Yang works to address systemic policies, programs, and legislative attempts to discriminate against and marginalize Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and other minority communities. Prior to his current role, Mr. Yang co-founded the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing the legal needs of Asian Pacific Americans in the D.C. metropolitan area. Mr. Yang, welcome to the committee. You may now proceed with your 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, and thank you to Ranking Member Portman and all the other members of this committee for holding this important hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before all of you today. I also appreciate hearing from my good friend and colleague, Wade Henderson. His words, as always, are insightful, powerful, and I agree wholeheartedly with his assessment and recommendations. Merriam-Webster defines terrorism as the systemic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. Terror, in turn, is defined as a state of intense or overwhelming fear, and violence or the threat of violence used as a weapon of intimidation or coercion. Under these definitions, the Asian American community has been living under a state of terrorism for the past 18 months, and certainly in the first 6 months of 2021. A Pew report shows that over 60% or approximately 60% of Asian adults have heard people express racist or racially insensitive views about people who are Asian than it was before COVID-19. A similar Ipsos survey in 2020 showed that over 60% of Asian Americans witnessed someone blaming Asian Americans for COVID-19. In the course of talking to the Asian American community, whether at community events, through employee resource groups at companies or government agencies, or just in casual conversations, some difficult themes have emerged. In these discussions, individuals have described how they have feared for their elders' safety, as well as that of their children and themselves. They have described telling elders not to go out alone, have described their own fear in doing the same, and how they have isolated themselves because of these issues. They have told stories of being spat upon, coughed upon, pushed, ridiculed in front of their children, and otherwise treated as the other, unworthy of respect as a human being. This is the lived reality of the Asian American community right now. If domestic terrorism is understood to be creating fear within a community, such that the community may be coerced, intimidated, or silenced, what has happened to the Asian American community must be properly viewed as terrorism. Indeed, the statistics confirm the basis for these fears. Through reporting done by Stop AAPI Hate, combined with data from Asian Americans Advancing Justice and other organizations, over 7,500 acts of anti-Asian hate have been reported since February of 2020. And we all know about the very real physical violence against our community, whether it is the murder of an 84-year-old Thai American in California, the murder of 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, or the murder of 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis, not to mention the countless other acts of physical violence taking place throughout the country. This violence against the Asian American community is rooted in 2 very dangerous stereotypes about the Asian American community, that of the perpetual foreigner and that of the model minority. Asian Americans are seen as the perpetual foreigner, such that we are seen as foreigners, not of this country, as of the other, regardless of how long we have been in this country or whether we were born in America. On the flip side of that stereotype is that of the model minority, where Asian Americans are held up as the quote-unquote good people of color when it is convenient, and used to plant seeds of division within allied communities of color. That model minority myth hides the complexities of our community and the economic disparities that exist among Asian Americans. Although the current round of anti-Asian hate can be said to have its origins in COVID-19, COVID-19 is not the only cause of anti-Asian violence. We have very legitimate geopolitical differences with the Chinese government, and that is likely to remain for the foreseeable future. If we are not careful, however, those differences will have consequences for our Asian American community, and we could expect a backlash against our community. We saw that happen with the incarceration of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent during World War II. We saw that happen in the backlash against the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American community after 9/11. And we saw that happen with the murder of Vincent Chin 39 years ago during the heightened automobile trade war tensions that we had with Japan. Indeed, just as lynching and cross-burning are used as forms of terror against the African American community, we have seen the same in the Asian American community. While Asian Americans were doing some of the hardest work building the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1800s, we saw Asian Americans being lynched and burned out of their homes in the western part of this country. We must be able to address these issues with a proper nuance and come together to call out xenophobia, racism, and hate whenever it occurs against our communities. And we must call out misinformation, disinformation before it distorts reality. The dehumanization of Asian Americans by suggesting that we eat bats, have unsanitary habits, or deserve to be ridiculed must be rejected. Likewise, misinformation about who is attacking Asian Americans must be corrected. Notwithstanding attempts by some to create divisions within the community between African Americans and Asian Americans, let me be clear about one thing. Studies done by NIH and University of Michigan have shown that, notwithstanding these social media efforts, over 75% of the attackers against Asian Americans are Caucasians. A very small percentage are African Americans. The person who killed 6 Asian American women in Atlanta was a Caucasian male, as was the person that killed 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis. African Americans are not the predominant group attacking Asian Americans, and such narratives are simply false. Facts, education, and data are the keys to addressing extremism. We cannot normalize racism and xenophobic behavior of those who seek to silence communities of color. Normalizing racism and xenophobia has created the conditions where people feel comfortable terrorizing other communities, inserting their privileges to intimidate and marginalize those communities. These are the issues we must confront if we are to prevent citizens in our country from terrorizing other residents of our country. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yang, for your comments. Our next witness is Mr. Paul Goldenberg, Vice Chair of the Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Council and Senior Advisor to the Department's newly established Countering Violent Extremism Initiative. Prior to his current roles, Mr. Goldenberg played a key role in efforts to counter violent extremism in the United States and Europe, including as Chief of the Office of Bias Crimes and Community Relations in New Jersey. He is considered an international thought leader in information sharing, conflict resolution, public safety, and counterterrorism policy. Mr. Goldenberg, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator. I just want to... We are no longer officially associated with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as the ASAC has formally resolved. So I just want to be on record that I'm not representing the department. Thank you. Very good. Is the microphone on? Okay. Is it on now? Is the mic on now? Yes?
Doesn't appear to be. That's tricky. It's on now? Okay, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Goldenberg, and I am here today as a senior fellow with the Rutgers University Miller Center for Community Resilience and Protection. And as I just stated, I most recently served as a senior advisor to the United States Department of Homeland Security, where there I was a member of the Secretary's Advisory Council. And while in that capacity, I did in fact head several initiatives focused on domestic and international terrorism, such as the Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee, the Foreign Fighter Task Force, and yes, more recently had the honor and privilege of serving alongside United States Marine Corps General John Allen, retired, where we together co-chaired the subcommittee for the prevention of targeted violence against faith-based communities. Before that, I did command the nation's first ever state office dedicated to the investigation and prosecution of bias crimes and domestic terrorism, situated in New Jersey. I'm very proud and honored to be here today speaking with your committee on these topics, and I sincerely applaud you, chairmen, members, of your steadfast commitment and unwavering support to address these serious matters impacting our nation's national security. Look, in framing my testimony, I think it's important to look first beyond America's borders. Across Europe, many houses of worship are surrounded by elite military units standing guard with automatic weaponry, reinforced by heavy armored personnel carriers. Guard towers augment the once stately and welcoming entryways. Flower beds have been swapped for barbed wire, all at a cost of hundreds of millions of euros, and producing a dreadful, unbelievable impact on the psyche of Europe's people. You see, Europe has become America's canary in a mine. In my work with Rutgers, along with former New Jersey Attorney General John Farmer, we traveled across Europe where we met with victims, painstakingly following the stories of those who suffered horrific attacks on their communities and houses of worship. Right here in the United States, as part of our work with the HSAC subcommittee, we had the sobering and humbling experience of meeting members of communities who had directly experienced the terror and violence, many of which were themselves victims of targeted attacks. Without exception, as these communities worked through their grief, they were so eager and committed to helping the members of our subcommittee with our work. You see, the adverse impact that violent extremists and domestic terrorists, including those inspired by white supremacist ideologies, are having on vulnerable communities are difficult to overstate. From Oak Creek, Wisconsin, to Whitefish, Montana, from Southern California to Sutherland, Texas, from Minneapolis to Pittsburgh, targeted violent attacks against vulnerable communities and the institutions they represent have struck at the very core of American freedoms, standing out not just for the escalating death toll, but for the cruelty of wounding and killing people at their most vulnerable, while assembled in their houses of worship for prayer. What was once unthinkable has become almost anticipated. The increasing influence of white supremacist, separatist, radical right, left extremist ideologies and inspiring acts of domestic terror and targeted violence is moreover not a matter of political opinion, but a demonstrable fact. Most attacks are committed primarily by lone attackers, as opposed to organized cells or through a system of cells. There are, however, a lot of similarities to the attacks once perpetrated by ISIS, jihadists, white and black separatist groups, and other extremists. They're acting very much alike. These bad actors are radicalized.
Anyway, all right. So let me go back and do that again. I'm sorry, I muted myself. So we heard something a minute ago from the guy, and I don't know who it was, but we heard something a minute ago, about the Asian hate crimes and how they said 90% of all the hate crimes that were committed against Asians last year were committed by white people. Caucasians is what he said. And only 5% were committed by African American people or Black American, whatever. So he mentioned Michigan, the University of Michigan study, which isn't published. From what I can gather, it's not a published study right now. There's the AAPI, which put out a study based on all the anti-Asian crimes. Am I not live now? What is going on? No, my sound is on now, but someone's calling me, but I can't talk right now. And I'm seeing the audio is working. Sorry about that. Anyway, so what it looks like, there's no study from, when you look at the AAPI study that they put out, it doesn't mention race of the offenders. It mentions everything about the victims, including what race, what dialect, all that stuff. But it doesn't mention anything about offenders, only the victims. All the other studies that I could find were just generic. They didn't have any data about the race of the offenders. So I kept trying to find the Michigan study that this guy specifically mentioned. And the only mention that I can find of this Michigan study was done in an interview with NPR where someone said, and I quote, "So I talked to a researcher for the University of Michigan. Her and her team have been tracking all incidents of anti-Asian racism and violence that were reported in the news during all of 2020. I just want to back up and say that these numbers are spotty because a lot of these incidents don't get reported. So what the team did find out is that white people accounted for 90% of anti-Asian incidents in 2020, but only 5% of perpetrators were black." Again, there's no study. I can't find the study that verifies that anywhere. This guy just went and he swore under oath too. So I want to find this Michigan study because I'll send it to the Republican Congress people that are there and their press their press contacts and say, hey, this guy lied under oath. You can get him here, because it seems that they're basing it off of a sentence of something, and he referenced that as a study. So just to be clear, what he just said, I believe with a 75% certainty that he just lied under oath. Whoever the dude was that just was speaking, saying that it's, and to be honest, I bet he's one of these guys. I bet this is his quote. Does anyone remember what his name was? I don't remember. Screams in silence. So this interview was on March 24th, 2021 is when it came out. But I'm gonna keep finding it out, and then I'll put this back up because they are going to be talking about some left violence in a minute. But listen.
Working with state, local authorities, moving the American public beyond awareness to engage citizenry should be a primary goal for 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Oldenburg. Our next witness is Dr. Seth Jones, who serves as Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. With decades of experience in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, Dr. Jones leads a bipartisan team dedicated to providing independent strategic insights and policy solutions that shape national policy. Dr. Jones also teaches at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome, Dr. Jones. You may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and distinguished members of the committee. This is an important subject, and I'm glad we're here to discuss this. As this testimony will highlight, objective analysis, sound data are more important than ever to gauge the nature and the threat of domestic terrorism, as well as effective responses, including responses that Congress can take the lead on. I'm going to divide my brief comments into 5 sections. First, let me just highlight the terminology I'm going to use, and I think it's important. I'm going to focus here on terrorism, which includes the deliberate use or the threat of violence by non-state actors in order to achieve a range of goals, generally political.
Real quick, let me just go over. So I think I may have just found the study, actually. It was Virulent Hate Plus reports. Of the 4,000 plus news articles that were reviewed about Asian hate in 2020, they only classify 1,023 as unique incidents. And then they specifically say information about the individuals involved in acts of anti-Asian racism and stigmatization were limited due to reporting practices and other factors. However, in the incidents for which demographic details were available, the offenders were also often male and white, because they're saying if the media doesn't say that it's not a white person, they're lumping it together as a white person. This is insane. This is insane. Only a small fraction of news articles explicitly identified the race of the individuals who were harassed or discriminated against Asian and Asian American people. However, in the few harassment incidents for which the news media explicitly stated the rate of the offender, the majority of the perpetrators of anti-Asian harassment were reported to be male and white, again, according to the University of Michigan. American politicians working at all levels of government made stigmatizing statements that supported discriminatory policies and proposals, and then they go and blame Donald Trump as well. But again, they don't have any facts. There's no actual data. They're taking of the 4,300 incidents that occurred. They're saying, well, we're not going to verify 3,000 of those. We're only going to look at 1,000 of them, of which 637 were property damage. So they're erasing those as well. So the violent ones, which is roughly 300 and some that they're looking at, on just that small data set of the 300 plus that were violent or not including property damage, then they're analyzing those based on what the news is reporting. So if the news isn't reporting that the offender is black, which we know the news doesn't do, we do it every single week when I do my mass shooting report. The media doesn't. They're really quick to point out if it's a white dude, but they don't point out if it's anything other. And so then they're saying, okay, of all the ones that the media does, when we're taking out this grouping that we can't identify, well, the majority of the media says that the attacks are white. It's just like the majority of the media says that mass shootings are committed by middle-aged, balding, fat white dudes, which is factually inaccurate. It says that the majority of mass shootings are done by people that are legally possessing guns, which is we all know complete and utter BS. But again, I'm going to try to do my best to fact check these people, because this is all propaganda. And one of you guys asked me, why am I showing this propaganda? Well, that's because nobody else is. And it's time for us to stand up and show what's actually going on in this country. And that's what I'm doing every single day. Anyway, here's the hearing.
Individuals target the military, police, and the government from all sides of the ideological spectrum, from anti-fascists and anarchists to those that are white supremacists and anti-government. So again, focus from all sides of the political spectrum. Touching briefly on the fourth area, tactics and weapons, we see a number of explosives and incendiaries used. You've seen vehicles, but in terms of lethal and fatal attacks, the highest numbers, generally by far, both between that 1994 and 2020 period, 66% of those fatalities from domestic terrorism were caused by firearms. 73% of fatalities from domestic terrorism between 2015 and 2020 were also caused by firearms. Let me just finish the fifth area. My written testimony includes a number of issues worth considering from a congressional standpoint, and we've also heard a number of comments from those that have testified so far. But let me highlight one issue with which the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, and that is, I think the federal government has to be much more transparent about the state of domestic terrorism. That includes data that the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and to some degree also the National Counterterrorism, we have to be more transparent as a federal government, including at the state and local level, in key trends. Numbers of attacks and plots, fatalities, targets, tactics used. I find the level of transparency troubling within the government, different in many ways from what we see from our partners overseas. British intelligence, including MI5, have generally been quite transparent about trends. The Germans have been quite transparent, including the Ministry of Interior. And when I was in the U.S. government, in the Department of Defense, we were very transparent when I was there about the significant acts, which included terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq. We are not there at this point, and I think this is an important component that you have already pushed and need to continue. So with that, I will hold my remarks, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones, for your testimony. Mr. Henderson, you represent over 200 civil rights organizations, including ACLU, the NAACP, Access, ADL. So that means you and your members are basically at the forefront of the horrible and deadly reality that the threat of domestic terrorism presents, from white supremacist, anti-government groups, conspiracy theorists, and the list of violent extremists that are operating in our country. My question to you, sir, is, in your view, how has this threat evolved for your members over the last few years?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. This issue of domestic terrorism, hate crime, violence, call it what you will, has been a significant problem throughout the history of the African American experience and many other communities, as I mentioned in my formal testimony, that have been marginalized in American society throughout the time of their presence in this country. Again, I noted, of course, the experience of African Americans with chattel slavery, with Jim Crow segregation, with the deprivation of access to the right to vote, and continued violence directed toward our communities by way of lynching and pogroms that have actually occurred in communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and like the community in Florida that has been affected by all of this violence. The same is true of other groups. My colleague John Yang talked about the deprivation of liberty suffered by Japanese American citizens during World War II, or the experience of Native Americans who were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands. All of these communities have experienced periods of violence directed at their members for a variety of reasons, but all of it stems from a source of white supremacist attitude toward these communities and the denial of their right to equal citizenship and equal protection of the law. Of course, the problem has been exacerbated in recent time by the availability of social media. And social media has contributed to the radicalization of individuals, to the isolation of others in ways that have fostered their involvement in this kind of white supremacist hate crime violence. It is an ongoing, continuing problem, one of significant magnitude, and needs to be addressed. Domestic terrorism is the #1 priority of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. And so labeling does matter. However, it affects, of course, the allocation of resources by the federal government to address these issues. My main contention is that the federal government needs to do what it knows it is required to do by law with respect to all persons in the United States. It has the resources to address these issues. It does not have, at this point, the political will. And that is what I hope these hearings will help provide.
Thank you. Mr. Fingerhut, the Jewish community has seen some of the worst acts of violence and anti-Semitism in the history of this country in recent years, and you mentioned some of those in your opening testimony. My question to you is, how can federal agencies, especially the DHS, collaborate with state and local partners to assist these communities? What are the things that we must be doing now?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate the question. Of course, as I emphasized in my testimony, the support of the federal government for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program is essential. And critically, sir, it is, and members of the committee, it is not only an increase in funding, but it is as well the support for the agencies that administer those programs at the federal and at the state levels, and the commitment for the technical support for all of the faith-based and nonprofit institutions that are eligible to apply for them. These are, by necessity, somewhat technical in nature, and we do our very best through our Jewish Federation system and with our other religious and ethnic communal partners to educate all of the faith-based and nonprofit institutions about the method and the technical details of the applications. It nevertheless remains an important responsibility of DHS and of the FBI to assist these communities. As I mentioned in my testimony, the Secure Community Network, which is an organization that we started together with a conference of presidents of major Jewish organizations in the 2004 post-9/11 era, is in direct and regular contact with the Department of Homeland Security and is prepared to assist them in that effort. Secondly, as I also indicated in my testimony, Mr. Chairman, it is important that the faith-based and nonprofit community be designated as a critical infrastructure, as have 16 other sectors of our community of the nation's economy and communal infrastructure, so as to require the Department of Homeland Security and the other federal law enforcement agencies to create a comprehensive approach to working with the faith-based and nonprofit communities. As you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee well know, in our society, the way American society is structured, the partnership between government and the nonprofit and faith-based sectors in the delivery of core and essential human services, as well as education and communal activities of all kinds, is an essential partnership. and recognizing that critical infrastructure, as we just evidenced during the pandemic. The partnership between the federal government and the nonprofit and the faith-based communities were essential to carrying our communities through the COVID pandemic, and it will be so as well as we tackle the domestic extremism issues. In addition, finally, I'd repeat the comment I made about increasing access to DHS's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies, protective security advisors, and cybersecurity advisors to assist the nonprofits that navigating the grant opportunities. Again, the Secure Community Network would be our representative and also works with other of the faith-based and religious communities in that effort.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the detailed answer. Ranking Member Portman, you're now recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for the information you provided, which was very helpful. Mr. Yang, I liked what you said, which is we need more facts, information, and data. And I think that's absolutely true. And we've heard today some data from some of our witnesses that is very concerning. Mr. Jones, can you discuss some of the data that you have compiled? And one thing I thought was interesting, you said that there are more attacks on military and police, I think you said law enforcement, than any other group. Can you tell us whether that's historically true, or is that just true in 2020? I thought you had some interesting data about other attacks, saying that threats and attacks are the worst they have been since 1994. But with regard to the information you provided us today, which is new to me, that the highest number of attacks have been on law enforcement, is that historically accurate, or is that just a recent development?
Excellent question. In response to your question about the targeting of government, military, and police, it is primarily a recent phenomenon. Government, military, and police have been targeted historically in the U.S. at various points. We certainly saw that in the mid-1990s in Timothy McVeigh's targeting of the Murray Building in Oklahoma City. But in terms of the number of attacks, we've seen amongst the highest levels in terms of attack target in 2020. So that is a recent phenomenon. And again, as I mentioned, we're seeing the perpetrators from all sides of the political spectrum, anarchists, anti-fascists, and others as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the concise answer, because we don't have much time here and there's lots of information I want to get out. Mr. Goldenberg, you talked a lot about your work and the factors contributing to the persistent threat of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. Can you talk a little about what you see as some of the common threads of domestic radicalization? And you've obviously got experience both at the state level and at the federal level through the Department of Homeland Security. Just give us a little sense of what are the common threads you've seen.
The tactics being used by extremists and radicals, from white supremacists to those that claim that they're going to attack in the name of jihad, to those even potentially engaged or involved, as you stated, sir, eco-terrorism. The tactics are very similar. About 4 or 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to co-chair the Foreign Fighter Task Force. We spent a lot of time studying the methodologies that ISIS was using to bring young men and women from different parts of the world who absolutely had very little in common, had very little knowledge, many of which weren't even that hooked into any particular religion, making their ways across oceans to join a fight and a war in the deserts of some unknown place. And we got very caught up in the cause, and we didn't study enough as to the effect. Why are these young, disaffected, disenchanted folks, these young people, joining these fights, joining these movements? Why are they being radicalized so quickly? And social media, it was all done. 95% of it, I may not be exact, of the radicalization was done through very effective, very savvy social media marketing campaigns.
Yeah, I think that we talked about the investigation we did here, the Permanent Subcommittee, which was a bipartisan look at why, and so much of it came down to the digital side, both in terms of organization and creating this motivation with white supremacists. I think the same is true from everything we know. And then on the actual attacks themselves, the ability to organize quickly, and the flash and bang effect we talked about earlier. So that, I mean, getting into the digital issues is really important. These platforms have created a bigger problem, clearly. Is that your understanding?
It is, but I have to state something for the record. I was very engaged and involved in Whitefish, Montana, which many people may not be aware of. It's a very pristine, beautiful place on the side of a mountain where 120 members of a Jewish community, many of them, I can't speak for all of them, literally 4 years ago were debating whether to leave their community. They were terrified. They were petrified because they were being attacked and trolled and threatened online from some very dangerous people. Some of these websites that were calling for attacks on this small Jewish community. In fact, the common denominator of these websites is the fact that members of those sites were involved in over 100 to 120 murders around the world, including Breivik, including several other major incidents here. Why am I bringing up Whitefish? Because as horrific, as horrible as these threats were perceived, people were terrified. It was, in my mind, a domestic terrorism incident, and it was very difficult to get any agency to even investigate it. And I'm not criticizing the agencies. I'm not criticizing the federal agencies or the local law enforcement agencies. They couldn't investigate it because they didn't have the probable cause to go ahead and open up an investigation, even though we had members of a community ready to leave their houses in terror, and we couldn't even get a criminal investigation initiated because we didn't have the laws or the mandates to work on it.
Well, those are important points, and I think that leads to some of the frustration out there is that you have these threats that are real, and yet there doesn't seem to be an easy way for law enforcement at local or state or federal level sometimes to respond. Mr. Henderson, we talked a little about the Nonprofit Security Grant Program earlier, and I'd like you and Mr. Yang as well to talk a little about that. This is an effort to provide community safety, community security. When we have gathered people in Ohio, it's the Christian community, it's the Sikh community, it's the Muslim community, the Jewish community, of course. But as someone who represents a broad coalition of these communities, how would you assess this program, and how can we get more people to apply, more people to understand it and to be able to take advantage of it?
Well, Mr. Portman, thank you for your question. It is an important issue, and certainly the Leadership Conference does represent nonprofit organizations that are committed to protecting civil and human rights. The engagement of these communities in addressing the problems that we have with domestic terrorism are critically important. But as I mentioned in my testimony, we have over 50 statutes on our federal books that can be used to prosecute individuals who are engaged in these activities. I alluded to the fact that those who are charged today with some of the violence directly related to the January 6th insurrection are being prosecuted based on these provisions. I think certainly educating nonprofit groups about the circumstances involved with domestic violence, encouraging the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to help educate these communities as well on how to apply for these grants, how to use them appropriately, would be a very constructive contribution that would help these communities better understand how they can be a part of the solution to the problem. But I think the biggest issue that we have before us is how do we encourage the federal government and the appropriate agencies to use the tools at their disposal to prosecute domestic terrorism in an appropriate way. That does include, of course, educating individuals on the use, or rather communities, on the use of these nonprofit grant programs. I commend you for your support of them, and I hope they will be a part of a constructive, comprehensive effort to address this problem going forward.
Well said, Mr. Henderson. We've got to go to our next questioner, but let me say that the Pray Safe Act also provides this information of best practices, which I think is really critical, and Senator Hassan is actually a co-author of that legislation. I know she's going to question next, but I think that's another place for information that is easily accessible online, and I hope that this hearing, among other things, will give more people an understanding of the importance of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Portman. I want to thank you and Chairman Peters for holding this hearing. I certainly want to thank all of our witnesses, not only for being here today, but for the work that you do. And Mr. Goldenberg and Mr. Jones, I want to start off with following up on some of the discussion you've had with both Senator Peters and Portman on the issue of online radicalization. Mr. Goldenberg, in your testimony, you compared some of the online radicalization techniques of groups like ISIS to similar efforts used by domestic terrorists online today. So, again, just adding to what you were talking about just now, in your view, are there lessons learned from combating ISIS's online radicalization efforts that can be applied to combating domestic terrorism threats?
Yeah, I think the primary lessons learned is it's almost, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use this as a comparison because I am a former police officer. It's when they interview the neighbor next door, and the neighbor next door, after a horrific crime is committed by the other neighbor, says, "I knew nothing. I knew nothing about this." Right. And I think it's incumbent upon us to really focus on training, spending time with families and educators and even the law enforcement community to better understand how social media, how this space, as wonderful it is, I call it the tale of two cities, has become a place where we have groomers and others that are seeking to radicalize your children, if not your teens, if not other adults. The tactics used by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups that we'll call traditional foreign terrorist groups, these same tactics are being used right here in the United States by those that are asking for some to commit themselves to white supremacist ideology. It's the same tactics. It's the same tactics being used, the same marketing.
So what you're really saying too is educating the general public and families about the tactics that their loved ones could be subjected to online. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You know, the old cliche, if you see something, say something.
Right.
When I first heard it years ago, I come from the New York, New Jersey area.
Right.
Through 9/11, I rolled my eyes, Senator. And now I don't roll my eyes at that.
Right.
People, if they see something, if something's not right with a neighbor, with a friend, with a child, I'm not talking about people spying on each other. I'm talking about if there are signs and symptoms that say that someone that's close to you or someone that you love is now being potentially radicalized, and these are the signs and the symbols, you need to step up and say something and maybe save the next life.
Thank you.
Including their own.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, you also mentioned the role of the internet and social media in contributing to the domestic terrorism threat. So in your view, what more can the U.S. government do to counter extremism and misinformation on digital platforms?
So thanks, Senator, for bringing up this issue. Two comments along these lines. One is, I should point out at the beginning, just to state the obvious, that a range of individuals and organizations involved in domestic terrorism are on multiple types of digital platforms, not just the big ones.
Right.
However, some of the large platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube they're capable of reaching larger numbers of individuals. And I think one of the successful efforts, because I've worked with a range of these companies, they surged during the height of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda activity to identify on their platforms individuals that were radicalizing, both humans working for these companies as well as algorithms. Right. They've been slower in the areas we're talking about. They've been slower on white supremacists, anti-government militias, some of the anti-fascists and anarchists. They've been slower to devote the resources, the individual expertise. I think they've started to move a little bit faster, but I would say more pressure on these companies. And again, I'm not talking about free speech here. I'm talking about violence.
Right.
Taking down Facebook pages that are inciting people to violence.
Right.
And I think, in that sense, a number of European governments are ahead of the U.S. in along these lines. So I think that's one issue. And it is also worth highlighting that a range of these domestic organizations are learning. So they now know what they can get away with and what they can't. So this is a constant process of rejiggering algorithms and educating those that are analyzing digital platforms. What are the word choices they're using to instigate? But I think continual pressure on these companies is critical, and that includes holding hearings so that with senior officials from those companies, so that they're held accountable.
Thank you. I want to follow up with you on another issue now. I previously co-sponsored legislation to establish a commission that would review the information sharing process for both international and domestic terrorism. I was pleased to see that the first pillar of the Biden administration's new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism includes a goal to improve information sharing. Mr. Jones, in your view, what specific steps can the federal government take to improve sharing terrorism threat information with state and local partners, including information regarding domestic terrorism?
Well, look, I think there is an important role. The National Counterterrorism Center has increasingly, and I think this is important to recognize that we talk about domestic terrorism, including here, but there is a lot of overlap between domestic and international terrorism. So I think the National Counterterrorism needs to continue at the federal level to also focus on this interplay between domestic and international terrorism. I also think then that there's an important relationship between the National Counterterrorism Center and the JTTFs, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and the fusion centers that they can share information.
Breaking news. Listen to this.
And civil litigation conducted.
This is New York Attorney General Letitia James finds Governor Cuomo did, in fact, sexually harass multiple women.
In the office.
Oh, this is some big news.
United States Attorney, Chief of the Criminal Division, and Chief Counsel to the United States Attorney. Ms. Clark.
Share this video out, guys.
Experience, credible, and deeply respected professionals. And together, they ensured that this investigation was both independent and thorough. Over the course of the 5-month investigation, the investigators spoke to 179 individuals, including complainants, current and former members of the executive chamber, state troopers, additional state employees, and others who interacted regularly with the governor. In addition...
See, I knew it was going to happen eventually. Hold on. I'm going to preload this video. This is some huge news.
Reveal a deeply disturbing, they reviewed more than 74. Governor Cuomo sexually harassed current and former state employees in violation of both federal and state laws. The independent investigation found that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, many of whom were young women, by engaging in unwanted groping, kisses, hugging, and by making inappropriate comments. Further, the governor and his senior team took actions to retaliate against at least one former employee for coming forward with her story, her truth. And Governor Cuomo's administration fostered a toxic workplace that enabled harassment and created a hostile work environment where staffers did not feel comfortable coming forward with complaints about sexual harassment due to a climate of fear and given the power dynamics. The investigators found that Governor Cuomo's actions and those of the executive chamber violated multiple state and federal laws, as well as the executive chamber's own written policies. This investigation has revealed conduct that corrodes the very fabric and character of our state government and shines light that can be present at the highest levels of government. But none of this would have been illuminated if not for the heroic women who came forward. And I am inspired by all the brave women who came forward. But and I thank them for their bravery. And I thank the independent investigators for their professionalism, despite the attacks, and for their dogged determination.
Sorry, it's buffering. I'm not sure why.
Truth.
I think it's back though.
And now we will hear from June Kim and Ann Clark, who will walk us through the report and their findings.
Thank you, Attorney General James. Good morning. My name is June Kim, and along with my colleague, Ann Clark, we have led teams at our two law firms in conducting the investigation into allegations of sexual harassment by Governor Cuomo.
Is it back,
We've now
guys?
completed our investigation and have made our findings and reached our conclusions.
Yeah.
They're set forth in a detailed report issued today. As set forth in the report, we find that the governor, on numerous occasions, engaged in conduct that constitutes unlawful sex-based harassment.
Oh my God, he's done.
Specifically, we find that the governor sexually harassed a number of current and former New York State employees. He did so by, among other things, engaging in unwelcome and non-consensual touching, and also repeatedly making comments of a sexualized or gender-based nature.
Man, I wish. Oh, I'm so tempted to jump in my truck and drive up there.
These were not
I want to see him put him in
isolated
handcuffs.
They were part of a pattern.
Please share this video.
The governor's pattern of sexually harassing behavior was not limited to members of his own staff, but extended to other state employees, including a state trooper who served on his protective detail. There are 11 complainants whose allegations are set forth in great detail in the report. Our investigation, 9 of them are or were employed by the state of New York or a state-affiliated entity. The complainants interacted with the governor under different circumstances. For example, some of them met with him regularly as an executive assistant. In our investigation, we concluded that the executive chamber's workplace culture, one rife with bullying, fear, and intimidation on the one hand, while normalizing frequent flirtations and gender-based comments by the governor on the other, created the conditions that allowed the sexual harassment and retaliation to occur and to persist. As the Attorney General has said, we reached these findings and conclusions after a thorough and independent investigation. We were allowed to and did follow the facts without fear, without favor. As you will see in the report, our findings are supported by extensive evidence that includes interviews and testimony from 179 witnesses and review of tens of thousands of documents. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Ann Clark to walk through some of the specifics related to the sexual harassment, the policy violations, and the retaliation.
We find that the governor on many occasions engaged in sex-based harassing conduct and conversations. The most serious was the governor's unwelcome physical contact with women, including touching intimate body parts. He engaged in this conduct with state employees, including those who didn't work in the executive chamber, as well as non-employees. One current employee, who we identify as Executive Assistant Number 1, endured repeated physical violations. On November 16, 2020, in the Executive Mansion, the governor hugged Executive Assistant Number 1 and reached under her blouse to grab her breast. This was the culmination of a pattern of inappropriate sexual conduct, including numerous close and intimate hugs, where the governor held her so closely that her breasts were pressed against his body, and he sometimes ran his hands up and down her back while he did so. There were also several occasions on which the governor grabbed her butt. Executive Assistant Number 1 had vowed that she was going to take these violations, as she put it, to the grave. She was terrified that if she spoke out, she would lose her job. But she broke down in front of colleagues when she heard the governor on March 3, 2021, in his press conference claim that he had never touched anyone inappropriately. She then confided in her coworkers who saw her break down as to what had happened, and they were the ones that reported the conduct to attorneys in the executive chamber. The governor also several times inappropriately touched a state trooper assigned to the unit to protect the governor. In an elevator, while standing behind the trooper, he ran his finger from her neck down her spine and said, "Hey, you." Another time, she was standing holding the door open for the governor. As he passed, he took his open hand and ran it across her stomach from her belly button to the hip where she keeps her gun. She told us that she felt completely violated to have the governor touch her, as she put it, between her chest and her privates. The governor also inappropriately touched women who were attending work-related events at which the governor made remarks. At one event in September 2019, while having his picture taken with an employee of a state entity, the governor grabbed this young woman's butt. At another event in May of 2017, the governor pressed and ran his fingers across the chest of a woman while reading the name of her company, whose logo was on her chest. The governor also engaged in a widespread pattern of subjecting women to unwanted hugs and kisses and touching them in ways that made them uncomfortable. Conduct that is not just old-fashioned, affectionate behavior, as he and some of his staff members would have it, but unlawful sex-based harassment. In addition to the physical conduct, our investigation found that the governor regularly made comments to staff members and state employees that were offensive and gender-based. For example, the governor crossed the line many times when speaking with Charlotte Bennett, a briefer and executive assistant, particularly in spring of 2020. When she confided in the governor that she had been sexually assaulted in college, he asked her for the details of her assault. When talking about potential girlfriends, he said he thought he could date women as young as 22, knowing that Miss Bennett was 25 at the time. He asked her whether she had ever been with older men. He told her that he was lonely and wanted to be touched. He asked her if she was monogamous and what she thought about monogamy. He speculated on how her history as a sexual assault survivor might affect her romantic life. He told her that she looked like Daisy Duke. He suggested that she get a tattoo she was contemplating on her butt and asked her if she had any piercings anywhere other than her ears. Miss Bennett texted to a friend on the day where many of these comments were made that she was upset and confused and that she was shaking. Another example is the governor's comments to the state trooper, the same trooper he touched on the stomach and back. After the governor had become single, he asked the trooper how old she was. When she responded that she was in her late 20s, he said, "That's too old for him." He then asked her how much of an age difference he thought he could have between him and a girlfriend and have the public still accept it. She suggested it might be a good idea to stick with women at least as old as your daughters. She then tried to deflect the conversation by asking the governor what he was looking for in a girlfriend. He responded that he was looking for somebody who could handle pain. Another time, when the governor found out that the trooper was engaged, he asked her why she'd want to get married because, among other things, your sex drive goes down. As detailed in the report, employees recounted a pattern of similarly offensive comments and conversations, such as the governor repeatedly asking Executive Assistant Number 1 whether she would cheat on her husband, saying to her, "If you were single, the things I would do to you," telling her that she looked great for her age, which was early 30s, and for a mother, calling her and coworker Alyssa McGrath mingle mamas, comparing Lindsay Boylan to a more attractive version of one of his ex-girlfriends and to actresses. Women also described to us having the governor seek them out, stare intently at them, look them up and down, or gaze at their chest or butt. In sum, the governor routinely interacted with women in ways that focused on their gender, sometimes in explicitly sexualized manner, in ways that women found deeply humiliating and offensive. Both federal and state law prohibit gender-based harassment in the workplace. In fact, the governor himself, in August of 2019, passed a law that eliminated in New York State the requirement that harassing conduct needed to be severe or pervasive. In New York, a woman need only show that she was treated less well, at least in part, because of her gender. The governor's conduct, detailed in the report, clearly meets and far exceeds this standard. We also find that the executive chamber failed to follow its own harassment policies and procedures, ones that on paper are consistent with New York legal requirements. This was exemplified by the handling of Charlotte Bennett's complaint. In June of 2020, Ms. Bennett told the governor's chief of staff about recent conversations of a sexual nature that were so uncomfortable that she no longer wanted to interact with the governor. The chief of staff relayed Ms. Bennett's complaints to others in the governor's inner circle and transferred Ms. Bennett within days. 2 weeks later, the chief of staff and a special counsel spoke with Ms. Bennett, who detailed interactions with the governor that went back to May of 2019. The chief of staff and special counsel both found Ms. Bennett to be credible. The chief of staff consulted with the special counsel and with Melissa DeRosa, the secretary to the governor, and they decided they did not need to report this to the Governor's Office of Employee Relations, GOER, or conduct any meaningful investigation. They simply moved Ms. Bennett and instituted a policy of not having a junior staffer be alone with the governor, and even that, they said, was to protect the governor. That response, we find, was a violation of the Executive Chamber's harassment policy, which clearly requires that all possible harassment be reported to GOER and investigated. Now, 6 months later, in December of 2020, when Lindsay Boylan tweeted that she had been sexually harassed by the governor, the Executive Chamber once again failed to report the issue to GOER. Although Ms. DeRosa, the special counsel, and certain other advisors knew about the allegations that Charlotte Bennett had made that the special counsel had found credible, no one treated Ms. Boylan's allegations seriously other than as a threat to the governor. Rather than any effort to determine if the governor had engaged in a pattern of sexually harassing behavior, a team of senior staffers, former staffers, and outside confidants with no official title or role mobilized to attack and try to neutralize Ms. Boylan by sharing disparaging information with the press. Within hours of Ms. Boylan's December 13, 2020 tweet alleging sexual harassment, key members of the governor's inner circle had obtained confidential memos, ones that were stamped attorney-client privileged. They were primarily about an interaction between Ms. Boylan and an assistant. They then redacted the names of individuals other than Ms. Boylan and started sending the memos to reporters. There was also a proposed letter or op-ed drafted by the governor that went through several drafts. The letter attacked Ms. Boylan for alleged conduct at work, for alleged conduct with men other than the governor, as well as postulating various political conspiracies, including that Ms. Boylan was funded by far-right Republicans and supporters of Donald Trump. Although the letter was never published, it was sent or read to a variety of people outside the executive chamber, either to get their advice or ask them to sign their names to it, and shared ultimately with at least one member of the press. The governor was arguing for the release of that letter. He was finally convinced to abandon it by a number of people who thought the letter was a bad idea, in part because what was in the letter couldn't be substantiated and because they thought that victim shaming would be bad as a strategy. Both federal and state law prohibit an employer from taking any action that would dissuade a reasonable employee or former employee from making or supporting a charge of discrimination. Under that standard, the confidential release of internal records to the press and the dissemination of the letter disparaging Ms. Boylan constituted unlawful retaliation. I will now turn it back to Mr. Kim to say a few words about our findings with respect to the workplace culture within the executive chamber.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. As set forth in our report, we find that the culture within the executive chamber contributed to the conditions that allowed the governor's sexually harassing conduct to occur and to persist. The culture also informed the way in which the executive chamber responded to allegations of sexual harassment, as Ms. Clark has described, through violations of their own policies and through unlawful retaliation. Well, what was the culture? Words that witnesses have used repeatedly to describe it include toxic, hostile, abusive. Others use words like fear, intimidation, bullying, vindictive. As one senior staffer stated bluntly, as the sexual harassment allegations became public in March of this year in text exchanges with another in the administration, I quote, "Hopefully, when this is all done, people will realize the culture, even outside of the sexual harassment stuff, is not something you can get away with. You can't berate and terrify people 24/7, close quote. It was a culture where you could not say no to the governor. And if you upset him or his senior staff, you would be written off, cast aside, or worse. But at the same time, the witnesses described a culture that normalized and overlooked everyday flirtations, physical intimacy, and inappropriate comments by the governor. One senior staffer testified that at a work event, she sat on the governor's lap. Another staffer said she recalled kissing the governor on the lips. The governor testified that those things may have happened with senior staffers. One complainant described her interactions with the governor by saying they were, quote, strange and uncomfortable. But it was like the Twilight Zone. The typical rules did not apply. You should just view it as a compliment if the governor finds you aesthetically pleasing enough, close quote. The coexistence in the executive chamber's culture of fear and flirtation, intimidation and intimacy, abuse and affection created a work environment ripe for harassment. As another complainant testified, and I quote, "What makes it so hard to describe every single inappropriate incident is the culture of the place. On the one hand, he makes all this inappropriate and creepy behavior normal and like you should not complain. On the other hand, you see people getting punished and screamed at if you do anything where you disagree with him or his top aides. I really just wanted to go to work and be recognized for my work and nothing else," close quote. Charlotte Bennett, the complainant Ms. Clark mentioned, who was transferred after she reported inappropriate comments by the governor to senior staff, summarized her experience in a text message as follows, quote, "The verbal abuse, intimidation, and living in constant fear were all horribly toxic, dehumanizing, and traumatizing. And then he came on to me. I was scared to imagine what would happen if I rejected him, so I disappeared instead. My time in public service ended because he was bored and lonely. It still breaks my heart. That's a quote from a text that Ms. Bennett wrote. This culture made it all the more difficult, if not impossible, for complainants to report the harassment from which they were suffering, particularly when the harasser was the governor of the state of New York. But one by one courageous woman after another stepped forward. They stepped forward to say, enough is enough. They came forward in our investigation to tell us about their experiences, the harassment they suffered at the hands of the governor. In our report, we've used their words. And their words, so long silenced, speak loudly for themselves. These brave women stepped forward to speak truth to power. And in doing so, they expressed faith in the belief that although the governor may be powerful, the truth is even more so. This is what lies at the heart of our investigation and the findings in our report.
We will now take questions, and the questioning will be directed by Delaney Kempner.
Hold on. Please say your name and your outlet.
Marcia Kramer from CBS. I wondered if you could tell me if the governor will be facing any, I know this is a civil investigation, but were you making any referrals to prosecutors so that he could face either state or federal charges?
Our work is concluded, and the document is now public. And the matter is civil in nature and is not does not have any criminal consequences. It is my understanding.
What? It doesn't have any criminal consequences?
That for the young woman whose breast was groped, that the Albany Police Department already has a report about that. As for anything else, as the Attorney General stated, all the information is fully documented in the report, and any prosecutors or police departments can look at the evidence and determine if they want to take further action.
Josefa? Hi, Josefa Velasquez, the city.
What?
Now that this report is concluded, will your office be sharing it with the Assembly's committee that is investigating whether or not these are impeachable offenses, and if so, what's the coordination between the office and the Assembly?
There is no coordination between the Office of Attorney General and the Assembly. The document is now public and will be distributed to members of the Assembly as well as the leadership.
Ms. James, can the governor be introduce yourself? Bernadette Hogan from the New York Post. Can the governor be sued in any way? Is there a statute of limitations, or are there any penalties specifically tied to this report? I know Ms. Clark.
Sure. There's no penalty specifically tied to this report. The women can decide, some of the women can decide themselves if they want to bring a civil action. The statute of limitations is generally 3 years under one federal statute and the state law, and a little bit shorter under another federal statute, although for hostile work environments, as long as one act occurs within the statute of limitations, one can go back to cover the entire hostile work environment.
And in regards to the violation against the executive chamber's own policy, what kind of violations could be?
I can't think of a specific law that would violate, but that certainly is taken into account in determining liability for sexual harassment.
Dave Evans from Channel 7. Ms. James, can I ask you, do you think the governor, given the devastating nature of this report, and I get what you're saying about it's up to local prosecutors if they want to move forward on this, but do you think that this would all be wrapped up well if you would resign, leave?
That decision ultimately is up to the governor of the state of New York. The report speaks for itself. And right now I think we should all be focused on the courageous and bravery of the women who came forward. And all of us should be focused on keeping women safe, believing women, and allowing women to speak their truth. And that's exactly what this document does.
Andrew Sipp from WNBC. You mentioned in your opening remarks today defending the credentials of your investigators today. Were you personally bothered by the governor's own remarks in the past week or so that you could just Google their backgrounds and draw your own conclusion that this is a politically motivated investigation?
There were attempts to undermine and to politicize this investigation. And there were attacks on me as well as members of the team, which I find offensive. And our focus, again, should be on the bravery and the courage of these 11 women and of the others who came forward. These allegations were substantiated. They were corroborated. And the team before you, Ms. Clark and Mr. Kim, are professionals who are widely respected, not only in New York, but all across this nation. And I support their work, will defend their work, and I believe these women.
Zach Fink from New York One. You mentioned that it corroborated a lot of what the witness testimony was who you spoke with during the investigation. When you interviewed Governor Cuomo, did he admit to or deny the majority of what was said here?
There was a combination. There are some incidents that he admitted to but had a different interpretation of. And there were other things that he denied or said he didn't recall.
Speak a little bit more about that.
This is insane, dude.
Can you speak a little bit more about what that conversation, that 11-hour conversation was like the other week?
I can't recount all 11 hours of it. As I said, there were certain things like he admitted that he asked Miss Bennett whether she had been involved with older men. He denied touching the state trooper, although he said he might have kissed her at an event. And there were certain things that he turned around and said that, for example, the executive assistant number 1, that he did hug her repeatedly, but claimed she was the one who initiated the hugs. So it was a mixture of admitting to certain things, but putting a different spin on them and denying others.
People outline in the report.
Shimon Prokopetz from CNN. So what are the next steps here? You have this report, obviously a lot of devastating information in it. A lot of people are going to ask, okay, so what happens next? And you're not referring it for criminal charges. What are the next steps that you would like to see perhaps maybe the assembly take or someone else take to have some other kind of punishment or something else here? Because right now it just seems like you have this report and it's out there, and what would be the next steps?
We were tasked with the responsibility of engaging in an investigation. And we have concluded our investigation. And our work is done. And so as it relates to next steps, that's entirely up to the governor and or the assembly and the general public. But the work of the Office of the Attorney General and these special deputies has concluded.
Do you think the governor should run for re-election?
That's a political question. The work of the Office of the Attorney General is done.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions in here, and then we're going to go virtual.
Hi, Dana Rubenstein from
This is insane.
This is a little bit of a hypothetical, but if an individual with a history of running a workplace like this were running for governor, would you consider that person fit to serve as the leader of New York State?
I don't engage in speculation, Dana. The report speaks for itself. They substantiated and corroborated the allegations and have issued findings that, in fact, the governor violated state and federal laws.
Okay, this is the last one here, and then we're going to go virtual.
Adam Reese, NBC News. As a prosecutor and as an attorney general, are you frustrated that you can't move criminally on these charges, numerous charges that you and the investigators have said are both that violate state and federal law?
It's not an issue of being frustrated. The issue, we were tasked with the responsibility by the governor of the state of New York to issue a report, and we have issued this report. And all throughout the process, we put our heads down, we've done our work, and at this point, we're going to allow the chips to fall where they may.
Okay, we're going to go virtual now. Fabian?
Thank you, everybody. If you have a question, please click the raise hand button. If you have a question, please click the raise hand button. First, we're going to hear from John Campbell from Gannett. John, your mic is open.
Hi, Attorney General. A couple questions, and I apologize. It's tough to hear some of the questions, so that some of these might be repeats here. But the investigation into the governor's book deal, as well as the staff resources that were used on that, does that remain ongoing? That's separate from this. Is it still ongoing? And also, can you make some sort of formal referral to prosecutors' offices based on this report today, or is that something that they would have to pick up the ball on their own?
The investigation with respect to the book and whether or not public resources were utilized is ongoing, and it's separate and apart from this investigation. And with regards to criminal jurisdiction usually is conveyed upon the Office of Attorney General. Usually we get a request under the executive law. And at this point in time, our work is concluded, and we will not be engaging in any criminal investigation with respect to the conduct of the governor of the state of New York.
Our second question is from Josh Dothy from Washington Post. Josh, your line is open. Josh, you have to unmute your line.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you, Josh.
I said, hi, Attorney General.
Hi, Josh.
There appear to be about 11 allegations here, 11 different victims. Did you find all 11 of the victims who came forward to be credible, and were you able to find contemporaneous notes or proof about all 11 of the victims?
We found all 11 women to be credible. There was corroboration to varying degrees, probably at the end of being most corroborated. Charlotte Bennett talked to people and texted people contemporaneously. Some of her texts were practically in real time regarding conversations with the governor. As well, the reports that she made to the chief of staff and the special counsel, their contemporaneous notes are quite consistent with what she has said to the press and what she told us. The state trooper, the touching incidents, the one where he touched her stomach was witnessed by another state trooper who confirmed it to us. The kiss, the governor kissed her once, that was confirmed to us by another state trooper, and there were other incidents where she told people at the time. Other people that we spoke to did tell people at the time, and we confirmed with the people they spoke with, or had written documentation, either text messages or emails, in which they recounted things contemporaneously. So things. When you see the report, everything is documented. Things were very well corroborated.
Our next question is from Emma Kinnery from Bloomberg News. Emma, your line is open.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering, you said that your work is done, but there's still a criminal matter in place. What will happen from there?
So I cannot speculate as to what will happen from external agencies and or external legislative bodies. That is entirely up to them. But as far as the Office of Attorney General is concerned, our office and our investigation has concluded. We will be issuing this report along with evidence to the general public.
Our next question is from Brian Tarnelli from the New York Law Journal.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I know that there was mention of a report to the Albany Police Department regarding the groping incident. Can you specify if that was made by the executive chamber, or has the victim herself stepped forward and given a report to the Albany Police Department?
It's our understanding that the report was made by the executive chamber.
Our last question is from Rebecca Lewis from City and State. Rebecca, your line is open.
Hi, Attorney General. I just wanted to ask, with this report out now, you said that you're not going to speculate on whether the governor is fit to serve or if he should run again. What do you want the public to take away from this report?
That these 11 women were in a hostile and toxic work environment, and that we should believe women, and that what we have an obligation and a duty to do is to protect women in their workplace. And what this investigation revealed was a disturbing pattern of conduct by the governor of the great state of New York. And those who basically did not put in place any protocols or procedures to protect these young women who believed in public service. I believe women, and I believe these 11 women. I thank you all for being here this morning.
Oh my goodness. What a news day so far has turned out to be. So, breaking this morning, at New York Attorney General Letitia James has said that Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has broken several state and federal laws and confirmed in their 162-page report that he committed crimes, and then said that they're not pursuing charges, that this was a civil investigation, which doesn't make any damn sense. If he's not arrested today, I don't want to hear anything about anybody. I mean, they went after Donald Trump. Oh, my camera's losing it. They went after Donald Trump. They've gone after everybody, left and right, for, oh my goodness, dude. I'll say it straight up. He's not fit to be governor, and the only thing he's fit for is a jail cell, and he should be in jail. And you should lock up his brother too, Chris Cuomo, the CNN host, because he's publicly come out and said that he helped his brother deal with this when it came out in the beginning. So he knows that his brother was a skis ball and sex offender. There's how he's not in jail right now, I have no idea. How he's not in handcuffs, I have no idea. I don't know how think about it with Trump, with the Trump organization. As soon as they came out and said there was some sort of, crime committed, the people that they charged were both arrested, right? And indicted. So why is this a civil? It doesn't. I don't understand. I don't understand at all. In some other news this morning, there's a lot of news. I was joking with April a minute ago, and I said, yesterday was a slow news day. Today is not. There's an active shooter at the U.S. Pentagon. Multiple victims are so far. At least two were being worked on by EMS with CPR. So there's at least, I don't know how many victims are. I haven't even read the article we've written on it, but we just put out an article. The latest update I see a minute ago, it's emerging reports of multiple people down at a metro bus station at the Pentagon. The Pentagon is now currently on lockdown. They're working to gather more information. There's very little information out so far. I did see something a few minutes ago that said that the fire department confirmed it's still an active. Oh, yeah. So Arlington Fire, this is 28 minutes ago. They've confirmed scene is still active. The Arlington County Fire Department did encounter multiple patients. NFI on patient status will be provided. So they haven't. There's just no real information. There's no. Oh, my gosh. This is insane. This is insane. Governor Cuomo engaged in unwanted groping, kissing, hugging, and by making inappropriate comments, the governor and his senior team took actions to retaliate against one former employee, Letitia said. Yeah, and here's the thing. Gates just tweeted that. Look at all the people that were calling for Gates to be arrested and all that stuff on unfounded accusations against Congressman Matt Gaetz. Remember that? That was just a couple of weeks ago. They still yell at him. But now you have an actual investigation that's been done and completed that says that Cuomo is a sex offender. And I'll just point that out, or put that out there 100%. Yeah, he's a sex offender. And he's not in jail right now. He's still in the governor's mansion. There's no reason for that at all. He should be in jail. He should be in cuffs. And the state police that's assigned to protect him should be the one that is placing him in cuffs right now, because he apparently, one of his victims was a female state police officer. This is insane. It's insane. You guys want to know about insane too. The New York City Mayor de Blasio has now made it so anyone who wants to go to a gym or a performance or some restaurants, you're going to need to prove that you're vaccinated in order to go to a gym in New York City, or in order to go to a show, or to go to some restaurants. I don't even know the full breadth of it because all this news started coming out all at once. So this is what we know. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is a confirmed sex offender now. We can confirm that based on the 162-page report from the New York Attorney General, who is not is not even presenting charges. I don't understand that. Isn't that the New York Attorney General? Isn't that a legal, or isn't that a criminal office as well? I don't understand how. Well, I know it is, because they went after the Trump organization and charged 2 people with the bull crap that they're putting up there. So if that's the case, then how come they're not? I mean, Andrew Cuomo right now should be national on television right now of them arresting him. You would think. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. People, Dan Bongino just tweeted out a video of Jen Psaki on February 25th calling Andrew Cuomo the gold standard despite scandals on the way he handled the coronavirus. How many elderly people died as a result of him? He's not going to jail for that. Apparently, he's not going to go to jail for any of the sexual assault charges that he should have. Man. It's insane. John Cardillo said, no matter how you slice it, 4 suicides of the 1-6 cops in 6 months is bizarre. It's not PTSD. No cop is going off to off themselves because of one kind of busy but grossly overhyped day on the job. So for anyone that doesn't know, yesterday we reported last night that there was a third Metropolitan Police officer who took his own life after January 6th, or after responding to January 6th. There's no connection to the actual event to say, we don't even know if these officers were involved in other shootings or what their personal life was or anything. We don't know. But because they went to January 6th and they responded to January 6th in whatever capacity they did, they're attributing that to a death of January 6th just to continue furthering that whole thing. Again, ignoring the fact that 81 other police officers died across the country so far this year, including 3 in the month of July in Chicago. And by their own hands. So that's important to say. It's not even the 185 that have died in line of duty deaths this year. 81 police officers, now 82, because late last night they said another police officer, a Metropolitan Police officer who took his own life on July 10th, is now, they're connecting that to the January 6th as well. Again, I'm not trying to minimize what actually happened on January 6th. I'm not going to do that at all. I believe that we have a huge problem in this country in not providing enough support to first responders and police officers and firefighters and EMTs and nurses and doctors and flight medics and anyone who's involved in first response type of situations. I'm a case in point. The support system for that sucks. But this is weird because now they keep trying to put that out. And I wonder, I got a couple of text messages as soon as I switched it over to the Attorney General, the New York Attorney General, her press conference today. I got a lot of reports, or a lot of people that tweeted me or texted me rather, and said it's all to take away from the elections, all to take away from the lockdowns that they're going to do, because they're going to slide all these restrictions in place, but then they're just going to bury the news about that by having this Cuomo thing happen. So that's going to be the main dominating news story that everyone's going to focus on, and then all these little independent cities and states are going to impose lockdowns or impose vaccine requirements. De Blasio, like I said today, or like I said a minute ago, let me see if I can't find it. Because I don't think we've written a story on it yet, because I just saw it. I just told April, because when I'm live, I can't do it. So according to CNBC, New York City Mayor de Blasio will mandate COVID vaccines for certain indoor activities. The New York City Mayor de Blasio mandated inoculations for a wide range of indoor venues at a news conference today, requiring proof of COVID vaccinations from employers and customers of indoor eateries, so restaurants, gyms, and entertainment centers. The order goes into effect August 16th with full enforcement beginning September 13th. De Blasio said the mandate, known as the Key to the New York City Pass, would encourage increased immunizations to combat the spread of the Delta coronavirus variant. Oh, God. I tell you, dude, it's happening. I tell you, it's happening right now. Someone I love and care about deeply, not my wife, got the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday. And I'm just gonna, this is, and you can't fact check this because this is real, and I have the text messages, all you scumbags that all try to report my feed. This is what someone that I care about deeply, who had the second shot of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday, sent to me today. Had my second vaccine yesterday, hurting all over and a low fever. My response, oh man. And then they replied back an hour later, I feel like I'm on fire and my bones are made of broken glass. Now, this is a person that's been through some shit in their life. So for them to say that, it caused me a little bit of concern. So I said, damn, make sure you go to the hospital if you, make sure you go to the hospital if you continue feeling shitty. Get it documented. That's the biggest part. Get it documented. And I know it's expected to happen, but this is someone that's been sick. You know what I mean? This is someone that has had issues in their life and has endured a lot of pain in their life. And for them to be, to feel that way, it's kind of frightening. And knowing that my wife is going to have to deal with that in a couple of weeks too, when she gets her second shot, it's crazy. But again, it's important just to point these things out as much as we can. Anyway. But so, yeah, don't worry. If you're fully vaccinated, you can go to a New York City restaurant and spend entirely too much on their food. De Blasio added that the city would begin inspecting businesses for compliance in mid-September. All affected customers and workers can either provide their vaccination cards or upload their proof of vaccination to the Exelis or Pass application. The mayor's order comes just a day after de Blasio mandated vaccinations for all of the city's new hires, requiring them to provide proof of vaccination by their first day of work without the option of getting tested regularly instead. De Blasio issued similar mandates for city employees and healthcare workers in July, asking them to either verify their immunization status by August 2nd or submit weekly negative coronavirus tests. Now, this is the same thing that Joe Biden has now instituted countrywide for federal employees, saying you either need to be vaccinated as a federal employee or be subjected to weekly, twice weekly, I believe is what he said, coronavirus tests. You also have to wear a mask no matter where you are, and you also are not going to be able to travel for work, and they're going to try to keep you quarantined. Now, this is happening. No matter which way you try to shake it, this stuff is happening. But you know what? The Dow has jumped more than 140 points, so who cares, right? Wall Street's making money today. New York, this is the AP headline. New York City will become the first big city in the U.S. to require proof of COVID-19 vaccinations for indoor activities. He even said it's like what's going on in France. He said this is the first city in the United States to do what France has done with their vaccine passport. Now, for anyone that doesn't know what actually happens in France every single weekend, well, that's where good old Americans and patriots have been taken, and not Americans, good old Parisian patriots have been taken to the street and fighting horribly with police. In rioting, full-on rioting, because they don't want to have to get vaccinated. They don't want to have vaccine passports. Now, for some reason in Paris, they only do it on the weekend. Tomorrow in Charlotte, or where is it? Raleigh, North Carolina, the same group that I covered on Sunday in Charlotte is going to be marching at the Capitol because, again, all these hospitals, and I got emails today from these hospital staffers down there that have already had their medical exemptions required. One woman was breastfeeding. She didn't want her child, who she's breastfeeding, to potentially have any complications from the vaccine. She said, I'm not comfortable doing it because I'm breastfeeding my child. And you know what they said? Tough. You got to get vaccinated. That's the official response from her, or from the hospital. Now this is going, oh, it's crazy. It's crazy stuff. It is nutty, man. Watch Macron. He's leading the way. It's scary. Someone else said it's not a vaccine. Well, okay, we're not going to talk about all that stuff right now. I'm not getting into whether it is or isn't a vaccine and all that stuff. I'm going to talk, obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, now we live stream to social media. We've turned off our monetization features on YouTube, so you no longer can send super chats and you no longer can become a member. And the reason we did that is because YouTube takes 30% of all those, and then they ban me for saying something that saying something 2 days before the CDC says, because I'm a journalist, so we're able to get the actual data out there. They banned me and refused to reinstate me, yet they still get 30% of my earnings. So effective yesterday, all YouTube memberships were shut off, and all YouTube super chat and sticker functionality was also shut off by us. We weren't demonetized. We shut it all off because I no longer want YouTube to make money off of me and my videos if they're going to be censoring us. If Facebook is going to be soon to follow there. So what I encourage everyone to do, because what we're now doing too that's different, I'm hearing a weird whine, which is weird. What we're doing, don't post phone numbers in my chat. Facebook, Samantha, delete your comment, please, or we'll have to ban you. We don't post any phone numbers in the chat ever, especially not on Facebook or anything. We are not Antifa. But yeah, so what we are doing now is instead of YouTube and giving 30% of our income to YouTube every single time, we are just going full board on our own streaming platform. We have it created right now, ptnn.tv. You could sign up to be a member there. Every single day, I will be doing an hour on social media, and then I'll be doing a bonus portion that's on PTNN. Last night, everyone found out how I really feel about the election and what I really think about the COVID-19 vaccination. Again, stuff we can't talk about on social media. So if you haven't already, make sure you sign up at ptnn.tv. And if you use code YouTube, this is for everyone. If you use code YouTube, you get 50% off your first 6 months anyway. It works out to be, $6 a month, something like that, which is pretty much what you're paying anyway if you're a YouTube member. Oh, man, what a weird day in the news. You're good, Samantha. Yeah, we just don't post phone numbers because that's like the whole doxing thing, even if you had good intentions. Let's see what's going on here. What is this? Crime surge in Atlanta. There's a press conference.
These locations, this is done with the partnerships of many of our state departments as well as our city departments. I'll speak briefly about the pool shooting.
I don't even know what they're talking about. All right, so someone said, how do you join again? I know you're being funny, but you go to ptnn.tv. Someone said you can't get in a stringer, but you're signed up, Steve. Yeah, okay, so this is the confusion, and I'll just say this, and then I'm going to end my live feed. I'll probably come back live around 1 o'clock today on PTNN to cover the White House press conference. I probably won't go out on social media because, well, I may not even do it. Who knows? I may just broadcast it to PTNN and not say anything because I got other stuff to do. But then I'll be live at 8 o'clock. So the way you do this, the way you sign up, first you're going to get, or once you go to ptnn.tv, sign up, become a member there, choose whatever plan. You got your monthly plan, your yearly plan, or your lifetime plan. Choose whatever plan. Then you're going to get an email. Now, it's very important. When you do get that email, you follow the instructions. And I know it's confusing because you're like, hey, why do I have to create 2 accounts? Because we have to manually tie those 2 accounts together. So when you get your email to download the app on your phone, what you need to do is follow those instructions. You have to set up a new account and then use the same exact email that you signed up with on the website. You are not trying to sign in to the app with the information. You first have to set up an account, and then I link it in the back end. I handle about 50 of them a day. It takes me probably about 2 hours to approve and make sure. So if you sign up today on PTNN, you'll be able to watch the live feeds on PTNN all day. And then if you and then at it'll be tomorrow or the next day that your live streams are available on the app. It takes a little bit, but you got to do it that way. Someone said, yeah, I'm not going through all that. That's fine. I mean, you can go watch CNN if you want, Brent, on YouTube. Go watch CNN, Brent. Anyway, so yeah, that's the deal. So I'm going to end this live feed on social media. PTNN, you are going to continue with what is up? Sunday's recap. It's Adam's show from Sunday. I'm going to Get that queued up and ready to go. So that's going to start playing here in a second on PTNN and Citizen Stringer. And then, and like I said, for everyone that's watching PTNN, we'll do the White House press conference. If it's really bad, I may rant about it for a little bit because I don't know what time it's coming on. So we'll kind of rant for a little bit. Someone said, as a founding member, do you pay again? Well, no. If you're on like a yearly plan and you were on that $12.99 per year because you're one of the first 2,000 that signed up, you're on that forever. You're on that forever. You should have got emails already, maybe last month, on how to sign up for the app. So just check your email. If you don't have it, send me an email. But yeah, you don't have to do it. Someone else said a workplace shooting in Tennessee. Oh my goodness. Keeps happening. So yes, ptnn.tv. And if you use discount code YouTube, you can get it. J.R. Renaud said, same here, cannot sign into app. PTNN subscriber since beginning. Already did that. Send April an email. Okay, again, you're not signing into the app. You have to create an account first in the app using the same email that you do on PTNN. Because my guess is that you didn't do it. Yeah, I know it's confusing, but I'll be honest, this way saved us $7,000 in the app development because they wanted $7,000 to make the two systems speak to each other. And I said, screw it, we'll just manually do it one by one. It is a problem, I know, but we're trying to save money when we built this thing. But April is going to get back to you, JR, right now. All right, guys, everyone on PTNN, you're going to see Adam's show from, I think, Sunday. And then as soon as the White House press conference starts, I will put that out to you guys on PTNN. And then I'll be live tonight, 8 o'clock on all of social media. I don't want to bring the White House press conference at right now on social media because then no one will get notified when I go live later. All right. We'll see. Someone said, how many mass shootings during Trump versus Biden? I'll do that tonight, too. That's a good one. So I will give you the full accounting of how many mass shootings in the first 6 months of Biden versus the first 6 months of Trump. Guess what? I already know because I know what there was on the first 100 days because I did one of those a while ago. All right, guys. Thank you for watching. Let me cut this.